I've been fortunate with good luck all my life. There I was, being adequately paid by the Navy, with a good deal of time on my hands that I could fill with preparation for my professional life, which was about to start again. Trotting regularly off to the BBC in my naval uniform, I did a good deal of moonlight broadcasting. So when the curtain finally fell on the Japanese War and I was demobilized, I was in a good position to carry on with my career. One Gordon Harbord was my agent. He was a very well-known name, though not perhaps a very high-powered agent, and he looked after a great many struggling actors, myself included. For the first 2 years after I was demobbed, almost all my income came from radio broadcasting. I met a good many directors and made many good contacts. There were some great people working for the BBC: Dylan Thomas, John Betjeman, Louis MacNeice. Many actors were still to be demobbed, and as I was a fairly healthy-sounding chap, it was a great time for me. Television had not yet grabbed the public, and radio was very popular. Eve and I moved out of the flat in Elverston Place and into a very small flat in West Hampstead, more suited to the modest income of a struggling actor. My old chum Malcolm Baker-Smith, who had been such a leading light in the entertainments in Illustrious, was now doing very well for himself in this exciting new medium, television. He was brave enough to give me the part of Noah in the play of that name by André Aubé, which was a very big production at Alexandra Palace. This was my first television part, and almost my last. It nearly killed me. I knew nothing about television, or how it worked. As a way of familiarizing technicians and staff with this exciting new technique, the play of the week was done twice, with 2 different teams of technicians. The first performance was presented on Sunday night, and the whole thing was then repeated again later in the week. It was all live in those days. Using 2 studios to perform the play, doors were held open as actors dashed along corridors from a scene in one studio to the next studio, holding on grimly to skirts, beards, costumes, and character, and praying that they wouldn't miss the next scene. It was exhausting. I remember Malcolm taking me home to our little flat in West Hampstead and my collapsing on the floor, whether from exhaustion or the demon drink, I'm not sure. I've always drunk too much, but it was a great experience. For all this, I was paid £45. Our daughter Joanna was born at Queen Charlotte's Hospital in November 1946. Deciding the tiny flat was no longer suitable for us, we looked around for something larger. We had no money, but we had a marvellous bank manager who was very gallant with his lady customers and had a very soft spot for Eve. Those were the days when bank managers were friends, and he used to come round at Christmas time with bottles of wine for his favourite clients. He must have had accounts worth millions, but he would come and visit us in our horrid little flat. Although I had nothing to declare but my talent, he just hoped he was backing a winner, and he lent us the money to buy our first house, 49 North Road, Highgate. I don't know what we paid for that first house. It must have been something pretty enormous, like £3,000. It was a lovely little Georgian cottage, one of a pair of workmen's cottages between a pub and a garage, and right on the top of Highgate. It must have been the highest little house in London, and we boasted proudly that the highest land to the east was the Ural Mountains. Being the highest house, it was also one of the coldest, but we were terribly excited, and we loved it, with its tiny little garden at the back and little fenced bit at the front, just big enough in which to put Joanna's pram. Those were happy days. My first stage play after the war was the part of Torvald Helmer in A Doll's House at the Intimate Theatre, Palmer's Green, directed by Ronnie Carr. Having not used my voice, or my body for that matter, in the theatre for over 5 years, I was anxious about the condition of my vocal cords, and sought out the help of a very well-known voice coach who lived near Wigmore Street. This was the only professional training I have ever had, and after 7 or 8 lessons I left her, but I think that by teaching me to breathe properly, the ladies saved my career. Stage fright used to frighten me terribly, and I would surely have ended up with that scourge of all actors who misuse their voice, the dreaded nodule. From Torvald in A Doll's House, I went on to the Aldwych Theatre to be murdered in the first act of a play called Dear Murderer. Playing opposite me as the detective was Jack Rain, about whom I remember 2 things, apart from the fact that he obviously disliked me. He was constantly pointing out defects in my theatrical technique. "Michael," he would say, "I hope you don't mind, but in theatre, if we pass another actor on the stage, we usually come across from behind." There was also another strange maxim about never being supposed to move when another actor was speaking. Jack was also one of the first people who's ever suggested that I might be a touch on the mean side. I was always running out of cigarettes, and this happened one night at the Theatre Royal in Bath. I called in at his dressing room to scrounge a fag. Holding out the packet, he said, "There you are, you mean bugger." I was terribly shocked and said, "Do you mean that?" To which he replied, "Well, since you ask, yes, I do." After that I took great care always to have a supply of cigarettes. A year or 2 later, I was the only Englishman in a play on Broadway called Moonbirds. I was playing the lead, so I was an important sort of chap, and I remember going into a Broadway production office, seeing a lot of small-part actors waiting to be interviewed in the vestibule. One of them was Jack Rain. He didn't get a part, but I don't suppose he minded much, as the play only ran on Broadway for 2 nights. It had been beset with terrible problems and clashes of personality, and finally, when we got to Broadway and I saw my name in lights, I thought, well, I have arrived. I went to the first night party and read the notices, and almost immediately the play closed. I didn't arrive for long. They didn't even put my name up the second night, because they wanted to save on the electricity bill. 1946 was also the year of Passport to Pimlico, a charming and hugely popular film which greatly appealed to the British sense of patriotism and identity. It was a film which exactly captured the post-war feeling. People loved it. London at that time had not been rebuilt at all, and we made the film in the middle of bomb-damaged Pimlico. I played a splendid policeman, very tense and hyperactive, as I suspect most of my performances in those days were too. I met and fell in love with Barbara Murray, who was at the beginning of her career. She was a rank starlet, beautiful girl, lovely and real, whom I was to work with again, years later, at the Aldwych Theatre, in The Collection by Harold Pinter. By now my agent was Al Parker, whose partner, Monty Mackey, largely looked after me. She and Al had a junior called Ronnie Waters, who gradually became my particular chap, and in fact has been my agent ever since, and a very good agent too. By now the work was fairly starting to roll in. In 1948, amongst film and radio work, I did a play by Peter Ustinov called The Indifferent Shepherd at the Kew Theatre, a little theatre opposite the Kew Bridge station. This was followed by Pastor Manders in Ibsen's Ghosts, directed by Willard Stoker. The year ended with Mr. Toad in The Wind and the Willows at the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre, Stratford. This was a very energetic show, which opened in the Christmas of 1948, directed by John Kidd, with an enormous cast of local children playing stoats, ferrets, rabbits, field mice, etc. Eve was also in the production, playing the nurse and the washerwoman. I know she enjoyed it as much as I did, and we loved working together again. On the first night, the little weasels, stoats and assorted animals gave me, as a first night present, a little Victorian brass stud box in the shape of a toad, and I told them that I would always keep it on my dressing-room table, wherever I was working, to remind me that However tired I was when I was playing Lear or Prospero, I was never as tired or as hard-working as when I was playing Mr. Toad at Stratford. It still shares my dressing room today. Spring 1949 brought A Woman in Love, translated from the French and directed by Michael Redgrave. April 1950 brought a turning point in my career. I was asked to play Nikolai Ivanov in a production of Ivanov at the Arts Theatre, Cambridge, directed by John Fernald, which hadn't been produced in this country for 25 years. In September, also at the Arts Theatre, I played Paul Southman in Saint's Day, a play by a new young writer, John Whiting. It was a bitter, interesting play. Stephen Murray produced it and I played the lead. Marvellous part of a chap as old as Methuselah. The script was way ahead of its time. When I was offered the part, I took a deep breath and thought, I don't know what this play is all about, but this is obviously a part I mustn't refuse. It attracted a good deal of notice, as it was Whiting's first play, and a great many well-known people came to see it. It was greeted with derision by the critics, which provoked many people, amongst them John Gielgud and Laurence Olivier, to write angry letters to the press, saying that the notices were quite wrong, and that this play was a milestone in the theatre, and everyone should come and see it. This all created a lot of publicity, doing me a power of good at the same time, encouraging Glenn Byam Shaw to offer me an incredible clutch of plays at Stratford the following season, at what was then the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre. I was offered the parts of Caliban in The Tempest, Jaques in As You Like It, and Sir Politic Woodby in Ben Jonson's Volpone. I suppose it was a turning point for me. I was fairly shaken by Glenn's offer. I didn't know much about Shakespeare, and I remember ringing up Violet Lamb, Cyril Luckham's wife, an old friend from Bristol days, who knew about plays and drama, and she was very shaken also. I've been offered a part called Caliban in The Tempest, and I can't make out what sort of a chap he is, I quavered. Her reaction was, Caliban? Jaques? And you're hesitating? Anthony Quayle was gradually handing over the reins of the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre to Byam Shaw, a splendid director who had started his career as an actor. He had been appointed director of the Old Vic School and Theatre Centre, and his work had largely been in developing that organisation. He had a very good reputation as a director, working with people like Edith Evans, John Gielgud, Godfrey Turle, and was now making a name for himself at Stratford. He, together with Quayle, bravely offered me these splendid parts for the following Stratford season. I did know something of As You Like It, as years before I had played Orlando as an amateur, and so I knew roughly what Jaques was about. But as for Caliban, Menenius in Coriolanus, and Volpone's Sir Politic Woodby, I had no idea, and had to say to Glenn, I think I had better confess now that these parts mean nothing to me. Glenn's reaction was, That's splendid, wonderful. Promise me you won't read up anything about them. Read the plays as much as you like, but don't read commentators and critics. Being a lazy bugger, I was only too pleased to say, yes, certainly. I had no wish to sit up burning the midnight oil, and that's how I approached every part I ever played, King Lear included. Eve, Joanna and I found accommodation in Goldicott House, a large country house 3 miles on the London side of Stratford. Joanna went to a local Stratford school, and we lived a very happy country existence. I used to go pigeon shooting in the Goldicott woods. Some of the cast, including Siobhan McKenna, Lawrence Harvey, used to come out and babysit. It was a happy season. The 1952 company was exciting. Strong bunch of actors. Ralph Richardson, Margaret Leighton, Lawrence Harvey, Mary Ellis, Siobhan McKenna, George Devine directing Volpone, John Gielgud directing Richardson in Macbeth, Michael Bentall directing The Tempest, and Glenn directing Coriolanus and As You Like It. Ralph Richardson was a dear old boy, but he terrified me. He could be very savage, and I had learnt a few lessons from leading actors. Normally on stage, Hawdon, we cross behind other actors. He was terribly good as Volpone, but not so successful as Macbeth. This was my play out, and I had been away fishing in Wales. Coming back to see the first night, I called in at the theatre to watch some of the dress rehearsal. I could not believe what I was seeing. It was an awful mishmash, with Gielgud trying to direct and Richardson saying, "I don't understand, old boy." Poor Ralph was in an awful state. In the fight at the end with Macduff, going 1, 2, 3, oh, my dear chap, 4, 5, 6. He was terrible. I went home to Eve that night and said, "They'll have to have a diplomatic illness. They cannot take money and show this to the public tomorrow." But they did, the next night, and it got the most appalling notices. Ralph was adrift, as we used to say in the Navy. The next day, going into the theatre to collect his mail, Ralph met fellow actor Raymond Westwell, who, being immersed in his own mail and not noticing Ralph, completely ignored him. That evening in the theatre, before going on stage, Ralph turned to the unfortunate Raymond and said, "You cut me this morning. If you do that again, I will put it about in London that you played Banquo to my Macbeth." He had a wonderful sense of humour, but I was very frightened of him. He could be distressingly autocratic and dismissive. I played Caliban opposite his Prospero, and he was lost there too. I think one of the reasons for Ralph's failure was that he was a bit off-beam during that season. He always had an endearing, attractive vagueness, but he was a bit scantier than usual that year, because he had been distracted, and small blame to him, by Margaret Leighton, who, playing Ariel to his Prospero, pranced around him with very few clothes on, looking utterly enchanting. He was determined to have a love affair with her, but her heart belonged to Lawrence Harvey. And when the time came to play opposite her in Macbeth, it all proved too much of a strain. It was a very pleasant summer. I had got to know the river a bit during the toad season 4 years before, and used to fish in a tributary of the Avon which came down from Goldicott. It had no trout, but plenty of roach, perch, and dace, so when not rehearsing, I would be digging for worms, fishing, throwing everything back except the perch, which were delicious. It was a nice town and country life. The excitement and sophistication of the theatre in the evening, the perfect counterpart to digging for worms and fishing during the day. When the season ended in October, we regretfully packed everything up, and it was up anchor and back to our little house in Highgate. I was almost immediately headhunted by Michael Bentall to go and play more Shakespeare in the 1953-54 season at the Old Vic. He had just taken over as artistic director, and I felt as though my star was rising. If I didn't know anything about Shakespeare before, I was certainly going to get the chance to catch up now. The Old Vic had a 5-year plan to produce all 36 plays in the first folio. On the 14th of September 1953, we opened with Hamlet, which we took to the Edinburgh Festival before transferring to London. By the time it got to the Old Vic, the production was really rather good. Apart from myself as Polonius, it was a glittering cast. Richard Burton giving his Hamlet, Claire Bloom as Ophelia, Fay Compton as Gertrude, my old friend Bill Squire as Horatio, John Neville as Fortinbras, another old friend, Pat Ide, doing publicity, and Clifford Williams, who years later at Stratford was to direct me in The Tempest, was player Queen. Burton was a notable Hamlet, and Fay Compton outstanding as Gertrude. About me, the critics were not quite so sure. Michael Hawdon chose Hamlet's description of a foolish, prating knave as a clue to Polonius. Fussy and meddlesome, but endearing. He was at his best in his early scenes with Ophelia, before he began to obscure less matter with more art. It was with some enthusiasm that we took Hamlet later that year to Elsinore and performed before 3 crowned heads of Scandinavia. Ironically, it was Claire Bloom, and not Richard, who captivated the Scandinavian audience, though there were fine performances from all. During the reception, I found myself talking to King Augustus of Sweden, who said that he often came over to Elsinore, as it was only 20 minutes on the ferry. Knowing him to be a keen fisherman, I soon got him onto the subject of fish. We spent the entire reception boring each other to death with fishing stories. Richard Burton was not an heroic figure of a man. He was stocky and short, with terrible legs in tights. In this 1953-54 season, he had been cast against type, which was a very good experience for him, but meant that he was not always very good at some of the parts he had to play, and gave some lazy performances. While in Edinburgh, Punch, somewhat maliciously I thought, quoted T.S. Eliot's Prufrock. "No, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be." Richard was an immensely likeable man, with marvellous charm and charisma, so that he could get away with anything. The audience adored him, and night after night there would be a crowd outside the stage door, filling the street right to the other side of the road. Out I would come, having given my King John, Parolles, or Prospero, and having collected some splendid notices, to be quite unrecognised, whilst Burton would be besieged by admirers. We had a sort of love-hate relationship, because I felt that he was a bit incensed that I had collected good notices, whilst obviously not exciting the audience as he did. There were many occasions when we'd be in the pub together, and he'd suddenly get quite ratty with me. There was undoubtedly friction between us. I was also jealous of him, and acutely envious of his wonderful power over the audience. I realized that a commodity Burton had that I hadn't was sex appeal. He simply oozed sexuality, and women just went wild. Afterwards, when he became a big Hollywood star and was playing tremendous parts, I was moved by his kindness in remembering his friends from the old Vic days and making sure we joined him in some of his films. I was by no means a perfect father and husband, being too selfish and involved in my work, which I loved, and my fishing, which I loved even more. As my theatrical career began to take off, I suppose I became even more neglectful. So, in order to see me at all, the family had to join me by the side of a stream. Joanna, by now 6 or 7, used to come fishing with me a good deal. I don't really think it was the actual fishing which fascinated her, but she used to enjoy just being around me and hearing my exclamations of delight or frustration, and simply being out in the countryside, walking in a chalk stream or picking flowers. Out of this grew a love of the countryside, which she has today. Eve loved the countryside too, and knew a good deal about wildflowers, teaching Joanna their names. But Eve was a much more sociable person than I. She loved London, going to the theatre, out to dinner, meeting friends, and doing all the usual civilized things normal people enjoy. But poor girl, she was sadly hampered by a most unsociable husband, who was little interested in entertaining or meeting people, not a sociable chap at all. Too mean and too selfish, I suppose. So we did very little of the going about together, which she would have enjoyed. It was spring 1955, and Rex Harrison was directing a French comedy, Nina, by André Roussin, a great exponent of boulevard theatre. It was a tale of a husband, a wife, and a lover, and although I didn't know it at the time, was a mirror of Rex's own marital breakdown, which might account for some of the problems we had with it. It had a strong cast, with James Hayter and my old friend Lockwood West, and Edith Evans playing the title role. The whole venture was doomed from the beginning. And if I hadn't been so seduced and flattered with the idea of working with such well-known people, I would not have touched it. Everything seemed to go wrong. Edith collapsed during the tour and had to be replaced by an understudy who had omitted to learn her lines and had to go on with the script. The male lead was found to be inadequate for some reason, and answering a frantic phone call from Binky Beaumont, the impresario, I agreed to take over at a week's notice. At the same time, Rex was attempting to direct the play on tour and perform in Bell, Book and Candle in the West End in the evenings. It was all very strange and confusing. After a week's rehearsal with Rex, I joined the company in Oxford. Coral Brown had agreed to take over Edith's part, and after a week's rehearsal with Rex, she came out on tour to join the rest of the cast. Until now, I had been the golden boy, saving the day, keeping the flag flying and the curtain up. I could do no wrong. Rex making me feel terribly important and clever. But now all that was changed. I could do nothing right, and was constantly being slapped down. Gone was the charming, sophisticated Rex Harrison, and in his place was a bully, a monster. It was agony. All the frustrations and traumas of the production seemed to be heaped upon me. I remember going back to my hotel, and grown man that I was, crying in bed at night, wondering how I could face rehearsal next morning. Binky Beaumont, having sunk a good deal of money into this show, unexpectedly came down from London to see how his investment was getting on, and whether the horror stories he had been hearing were true. We opened at the Haymarket Theatre in London a week later, and it was a disaster, closing after 5 weeks. The play was fine. It was a disaster because of Rex Harrison. Meeting Coral Brown made up for a good deal of the nightmare of Nina. I liked her very much indeed, from the first moment I met her. She was terribly attractive, with a marvellous dry sense of humour which got us through many tricky moments, and at the same time was wonderfully warm and kind. We were terribly attracted to each other, and managed to keep it all under control until one night, looking into her dressing room after the show as usual, to have a drink and a quick chat about the misfortunes of the evening, she was standing in front of the mirror in her dressing gown. When she saw me, she let it slip to the floor. She was beautiful naked, and I was finished. I fell, and she became terribly important to me. Too important. My marriage and family life were threatened. Eve was caused much unhappiness, and the affair had to end. Probably the most extraordinary piece of filmmaking in which I had the pleasure to take part happened in Italy in 1962. It was in the epic to end all epics, Cleopatra. By 1962 standards, Cleopatra was rapidly turning into the most expensive film ever made. There was a definite sense of unease in the boardroom of 20th Century Fox. A series of flops at the box office and a feeling that films were going out of fashion as television became the thing made it imperative that this new, highly publicized venture be the success that would restore the flagging film industry. Fox threw money at it like water. For the actors this meant a long ride on what many feared would be the white elephant of the cinema. One will never know how much was really sunk into the script, but I gather the figure crept beyond $40 million. Joe Mankiewicz was expensively extricated from something else and brought in to replace the original director, Ruben Mamoulian. Elizabeth Taylor made her entrance, having negotiated a £1 million contract, which had worked its way up to $3 million by the time the film was finally in the can. As Melvyn Bragg has said in his biography of Richard Burton, all was fair in the jungle of Hollywood, and she understood the industry. She would be following in the steps of such greats as Claudette Colbert, Vivien Leigh, who had both taken the role in earlier films of the story. When she walked onto the set, despite the illnesses that often plagued her, she gave the most regal performances. She had an incredible allure, and with those wonderful eyes, it was understandable that she would fascinate Burton, who was deeply susceptible to feminine charms. Joe Mankiewicz was highly respected and amiably juggled cast and crew, directing us all through the film in spite of some bloody awful weather, and rewriting the script late into the night in a bar or hotel room. Lines would often be handed to you written on bits of scrap paper. This brought a certain spontaneity to the shooting and made for a lively atmosphere on set. Mankiewicz drew a great performance out of Richard Burton, who had lost none of his charm and presence since his Old Vic days. Sadly, though, as 3.5 hours were chopped from the final version, most of Richard's finest moments ended up on the cutting-room floor. I had been hired to play Cicero. My contract, which had been for 8 weeks, was extended and extended until I had finally been in Rome for 9 months. Elizabeth seemed to have one illness after another. The weather didn't help. Schedules had to be changed, scenes brought forward, hastily written on the backs of envelopes and filmed the next day, lines having to be learnt on set, which caused Rex Harrison a bit of trouble. There was no question of any in-depth investigation of character. It all had to come off the top of the head. It was all vaguely reminiscent of weekly rep. Panic, however, was setting in. Cleopatra was becoming the most written about and talked about motion picture in history. Filming had gone on for so long that the boy employed to play Cleopatra's young son by Caesar had grown too tall, and next to Elizabeth appeared to be as big as Jack Dempsey. Shooting was continually interrupted for the most ridiculous and unexpected reasons. Rex Harrison made a fuss when he discovered that Elizabeth's chauffeur was getting all his expenses paid by the film company and refused to continue filming until they accorded his chauffeur the same courtesy. Then one day in April, the loud mewing of a cat brought the entire film to a halt. After intensive searching, workmen tore the set apart to discover a cat and 4 very small kittens, cosily curled up just out of reach under the framework of the set. The poor little mother was enticed out with pieces of raw liver, but the kittens took a little while longer to extricate, and the entire exercise added $17,000 to an already straining budget. While all this was going on, the months rolled by, and the families of actors and crew flew out to Rome to be reunited with long-lost loved ones. I remember Elizabeth bringing in not only children and a full staff, but a menagerie of animals. Eve and Joanna joined me in Rome, and we had a merry time. The backers of the film must have been having nightmares, but we all made the most of it and had a very good time at the company's expense. We all went skiing, a very dangerous thing for actors to do, but caution was thrown to the winds. Caps flung over windmills, and there was a feeling of reckless abandon in the air. There was much socializing and jollity, and taking over of little taverns in the mountains. One evening, after a hard day's shooting, we all took off for a fish restaurant, miles away from Rome. Elizabeth came with me in my little car, and neither of us having a very well-developed sense of direction, we drove round and round, stopping occasionally to get out and read signposts by the light of a torch. We became more and more inextricably lost. We laughed a good deal and were rather enjoying ourselves, and I'm ashamed to say we both found it all terribly funny, never giving a thought to any anxiety friends and lovers might be feeling. To everyone's intense irritation, we eventually fetched up at the restaurant, hours late and giggling foolishly, and were greeted by sighs of relief rather than a cheer. Elizabeth being so highly insured, the film company, now tuned for every disaster, had alerted the Carabinieri, and half the police force in Rome were out looking for us. We felt deeply ashamed. adventurous radio director, Nestor Payne, met a lawyer called John Mortimer, and realizing he had a play in him somewhere, she badgered away until he eventually came up with a perfect little jewel in one act called The Dock Brief. A dock brief, for the uninitiated, is a now extinct legal procedure whereby a criminal with no defence lawyer could point to any barrister wearing a wig and sitting in the court doing nothing and request that he should represent him. A hurried consultation in the cells would follow, with the unfortunate barrister being paid a guinea from the public funds, and the case would proceed. I played the clapped-out old lawyer whose life had been an almost total disaster, who had never had a case to defend, and who was suddenly presented with the defence of an old chap who had killed his wife. It was a hopeless case, but it was the only one he had ever had, and he was determined to make the best of it. It was what the Liverpool Echo called a sympathetic study in failure, and summed up my character as a faded barrister, a cousin under the skin to Malvolio. David Kossoff played the murderer, who keeps insisting on his guilt, the whole thing taking place in a prison cell. We did it on radio, and it was a great success. As television had only just begun to impinge on the public, radio drama was still hugely popular. So we then did it on the television, with music by Anthony Hopkins. Again, it was a great success, gaining for me the Television Actor of the Year award, and inspiring Michael Codron, the theatre producer, to put it on the stage. He was bravely setting up a theatre season at the Lyric Hammersmith, opening with a play called The Birthday Party by an unknown writer called Harold Pinter, to which nobody came at all, until a magnificent notice came from Harold Hobson, who had been to an empty matinee. As the dock brief was a short play, Codron suggested to John Mortimer that he write a companion piece, or if not, that he might consider putting on a play by Ionesco. Under the impression that Ionesco might be a branch of the United Nations, Mortimer quickly came up with a companion play, an autobiographical piece called What Shall We Tell Caroline?, about the perils of bringing up a daughter. So, with Stuart Burge directing and Maurice Denham replacing David Kossoff, who was committed to something else, we opened at the Lyric Hammersmith on the 9th of April, 1958, to excellent notices, transferring later to the Garrick Theatre. The opening coincided with a transport strike. London came to a standstill, and plays folded everywhere, including ours. Such are the vagaries of this profession. 46 North Road was becoming too small for us, so we went to live in a large Georgian house in Highgate, belonging to a friend of ours, who had just got a job as headmaster of Dartington, the coeducational school in Devon. He needed someone to take over his London house, and we happily obliged, enjoying the unaccustomed space and lovely big garden. We kept dogs, grew vegetables, and bought Joanna a grand piano. This piano proved to be an awful bore in later years, as, whenever we got the urge to move anywhere, it always had to be considered, rather like some huge, awkward member of the family. Oh, God, where can we put Joanna's piano? It was all very worthwhile, as she was very good at the piano, and when she was 9 we sent her to Dunhurst, the prep school for Bedales, where they encouraged her playing. Eventually our friends needed their house back, and the large Georgian house was replaced by a tiny cottage in Kensington, at the bottom of Church Street. We'd got used to having a large garden, and although we found our new home convenient, we felt cramped, and started in a lackadaisical way to look for a country cottage, a rural retreat to which we could all escape at weekends. I was by this time a member of the Piscatorial Society, a grand-sounding name for a trout fishing club, which has been a good deal of my life ever since. I used to go down to Berkshire to fish on the River Lambourne, staying in the Three Horseshoes, a pub in a village called Donnington, with a friendly landlord and his wife. Eve and I were very taken with the area and decided to look around for our country retreat. The local estate agent looked at me pityingly when I mentioned that I might be able to go up to the immense sum of £1,000. He disappeared and didn't show us anything until one day, when I was fishing on the Lambourne, Mr. Barton of the local agents, Druitt Neat, pointed out a row of 3 semi-detached Victorian labourers' cottages, which were for sale. The cottages were as they had been built in 1870, with solid brick walls, but no plumbing, not even a tap, no drainage, and earth closets. Water was taken from the river, or, if you felt very posh, from the tap at the top of the lane. There were also sitting tenants at each of the outer cottages, one being a retired old able seaman who was obviously soon to meet his maker, and a salt-of-the-earth couple named Robbins. Charlie Robbins worked for the railway, and Mrs. Robbins worked for anyone in the village who needed some good cleaning done. So we would be buying tenants at both ends, with only the middle bit for us. The asking price was £850. Each? I asked. No, the whole lot, they said. Knowing one was supposed to strike a bargain on these occasions, I offered £800 and was accepted. It was 1959, and I was off to New York about this time to do the ill-fated Moonbirds, returning 6 months later to find that the ancient mariner had indeed gone to his father's, and we were left with the Robbins family in the end cottage. Though we explained to them that a good deal of renovation was to take place, nothing would induce them to make a temporary move. So we modernized their cottage around them and knocked the other 2 cottages into one. We put in bathrooms and electricity and literally pulled the cottage to pieces around their ears. They put up with it all with great fortitude. When it was finally done, Mrs. Robbins was thrilled and excitedly told Eve the comments from their daughter-in-law, Ruby, who had been called in to see the renovations. "You know, Mother, it's as good as a council house now." We felt gratified. There we have stayed for the last 30 years. I shamefacedly put up the rent to 17 shillings and sixpence, and there it stayed until Mrs. Robbins followed her husband to Abraham's bosom. Now I rent the cottage to the Watermill Theatre opposite, a project which I viewed with dismay when it first opened 30 years ago, since the whole point of moving to the country was to get away from the theatre. But now I have done a complete volte-face and look upon the theatre and its achievements with great pride and affection, and I am proud to be president of the Friends of the Watermill. In 1962, I was in the RSC, working in a double bill at the Aldwych Theatre in a brand-new translation by Michael Mayer of a short, claustrophobic play by Strindberg called Playing with Fire. A fearsome affair about a frightful family in which I played a dashing romantic grandpa, and a new play by Harold Pinter, The Collection, which was to be co-directed by Peter Hall and Harold himself. Rehearsals took place at the Aldwych Theatre and in a large room at the YMCA in Great Russell Street. I remember we were constantly interrupted as people, presumably lost, stuck their heads round the door, hesitated, apologized, and withdrew, to Harold's increasing and all too visible annoyance. Harold had written the piece, a tale of amorous complications and suspected infidelity, for television. I played Harry, a rich middle-aged homosexual dress designer, looking very sly and decadent in a dressing gown. John Ronayne played Bill, Harry's young protégé, with Kenneth Haig as James and Barbara Murray as Stella. Playing the small part of a maid was a sweet young actress called Patricia England, with whom I fell madly in love immediately. It was virtually her first job after leaving drama college. She was very funny and very frightened, and we made each other laugh a good deal. We adored each other, but her heart was elsewhere. Off she went to marry her young actor and live with him in Stratford and have babies. We were to meet again some 12 years later within the hallowed portals of the BBC. The play was Harold Pinter's No Man's Land, a radio production with Dirk Bogarde playing the other main role. But to return to the collection, where did that character Harry come from in my repertory bag? I'm not homosexual, and had never played one before, but it was fascinating to find this chap arriving. I got to know him very well, and it was enormously satisfying. I used him again later, when I played a homosexual man from the ministry in the film The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, years later, with Richard Burton. I remember we had a terrible time with a cat in the play. We had a double set with my flat on one side and the flat of the woman in the play, Barbara Murray, on the other side. The wretched cat would keep wandering from flat to flat, until in exasperation the stage management finally gave it a mild pussycat tranquilizer, which had a disastrous effect on the wretched animal's bowels. As poor Barbara was wearing a white suit, the rest may be imagined. I have worked with Peter Hall 2 or 3 times since, and I admire him immensely as a director and hugely enjoy working for him, in spite of the fact that he once became very cross with me for likening the National Theatre building to Lubyanka prison. An unfortunate and tactless remark which found its way into the chat column of a daily newspaper. I hope he has forgiven me.